So I had severe asthma growing up, so I was in the ICU when I was 5 years old. We had a CNC milling machine at home. I got a scholarship to go to Apple's developers conference in San Francisco. We created this one map for all of science. Most of that first prototype was basically negative. We posted Litmaps on Product Hunt, for example, and people were really, really liking it there. We have basically grown to 400,000 users total. We've now just passed 1 mil of annual recurring revenue.
Was that Daniel Batten who's been coaching you?
Yeah, so he was one of the investors and had coached me a lot.
This is Mark Pawlikowski, and welcome to the TechMates podcast, where my partner Henrik and I explore how Kiwi and Aussie founders are reshaping the future and what sets them apart. Henrik and I have been part of successful companies in Silicon Valley and Europe, and now bring that expertise to partner with entrepreneurs in Australasia. By sharing the personal stories of successful Kiwi and Aussie founders and how they got here, we hope to inspire you to dream big. This is TechMates, bringing an outsider's perspective to the stories of those daring to disrupt down under. Let's dive in.
All right, Axton, thank you so much for joining us on TechMates.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So we want to get into your story. You are the founder and CEO of Litmaps. We're going to talk about the company. We're going to talk about some updates on the company as well, which is super exciting. But as we always do, we want to start with your background, where you grew up, and what kind of really influenced you in your childhood. So you are from Hamilton, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. In the Waikato, it's a growing town that gets a lot of crap thrown at it. But yeah, it was a great place to grow up.
Well, I mean, for people who are not from New Zealand, why does it get a lot of
There's always this sort of rivalries and, small towns, not much happening and that sort of thing.
I see. Cool. And what was your childhood like? What were you into as a child?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my story is kind of there's an early event which I guess impacted me a lot. So I had severe asthma growing up. So I was in the ICU when I was 5 years old. And so that did impact me growing up, obviously. So I missed out a bit of school early on, and that, impacted what I was interested in. So I wasn't as sporty as a kid and that sort of thing early on.
Wow. What? So you had that up until you were 5, or?
Yeah, so it's like 5 and towards 6, I guess. So I was sort of in and out in those years. Yeah, I guess had to figure out what the treatment strategy was, and that, was able to use inhalers and things like this to mitigate some of the inflammation and reaction. I guess it's sort of like a immune response in some ways, but there's also unclear sometimes what causes it.
And did it get sort of treated later?
Yeah, so I guess it got really bad, and then it sort of just started to clear up on its own, and then partly treatments like Ventolin and inhalers really helped, and having nebulization was really important. So yeah, a lot of that. Also, I don't remember that well, so it's like a strange history. I got to talk to my brother and my parents about what happened to learn about it over time. And you sort of have this outsider perspective because you're so young, you don't really remember a lot. But yeah, definitely was treated and don't really feel the effects today.
How do you think that impacted you?
Yeah, I think it is also part of this, founder story a little bit for me, but it sort of made me, really appreciate the sort of system around treatment and medical care and things like this, to be like, there's treatments and things that can help people. And that started to get me down, do I look at the medical pathway and things like this, or biomedical science is kind of an interesting thing. So sort of health and learning about the body was a really big impact over time for me. Yeah. So that was a massive outcome.
And you were not able to really run around outside. I love sports as a kid. What else did you get into as a kid?
Yeah, obviously the classic was, video games, so the alternative to running around outside. So yeah, love that obviously. But also there was sort of a lot of hobbies. So I guess my dad was really early on, interestingly, in the radio-controlled model aircraft space. So he flew these like pylon races, which is, I guess, a plane that flies around 3 vertical pylons in a sort of racetrack in the air. And so you're controlling it as a driver, and then you have a caller who's at the other end telling you when to turn. So you turn earlier than the others and sort of have a shorter flight path. And so that was like really early in the radio remote controlled sort of system with servos and things that were still really early technology. So I think he was, really pioneering in that space for creating lightweight aircraft and doing lots of things there. So just observing all those hobbies and things was really interesting to me. So yeah, I guess we're always around some tinkering in the workshop at home in the garage.
So this was your dad's hobby that you got into?
Yeah, I sort of built my own little aircraft and things, not as sophisticated, but it sort of got me into like, there's some tech and interesting things here. And I guess playing with video games and things, you kind of think, that's kind of an interesting thing to play around with. Also, it was like, watch and learn and understand what's going on. And Dad always wanted to take us through those things to understand, not just the theoretical, but the nuts and bolts and the practical.
What did he do?
Yeah, he had an interesting story. So I guess he went all the way from sort of laboring and doing things like driving a bulldozer in the backcountry to clearing tracks and that sort of thing on farms, to then being maybe before that actually sort of an automotive engineer. So he practiced on Citroen cars. They kind of it's got a lot of technology in the old cars, so like the DS and some things like this, but adaptive hydraulic suspension and air suspension way before a lot of other cars had it. So they had a really nice ride. And so he learned a lot of this sort of automotive engineering techniques and things, and then eventually got into sort of the meat industry and making robotic machinery for that space. And so there's even a story about how we had a CNC milling machine at home, which is what, an iPhone is sort of milled out of using one of those machines, or making a die for a mold. And so, yeah, lots of interesting upbringing, being around that sort of thing, and programming sort of
He was doing this, you said, the robotics for food industry?
Yeah, so he worked at Murrins for a little bit, which is like an ag research related place where they did R&D for, there's the slaughterhouse and there's various machines as part of that, which I guess New Zealand's background in being primary industry, there's lots of stuff around sort of that food production stuff. So that's why he was around that. But yeah, building things like it's a bit gruesome, but things to, package meat and squeeze it and, split heads open and all these sorts of things.
Did you have an idea of what you're going to do with your life when you grew up, like as a teenager?
Not at this stage. Yeah, I think until quite late in high school, I was really sort of unclear what I wanted to do. So I looked at things like economics. I really liked economics as a subject. I sort of naturally did well. And I was like, that could be a really cool career path. And then I went to a bank randomly and sat with like a business banking manager and thought, this is what you do as an economist, and sort of see what they were doing. And I was like, this is I didn't really click with it, and it was really tough. And then all my mates were going into pre-med and that sort of thing. And so that sort of, I'll just follow what the successful kids are kind of doing and go down that pathway.
Excellent. Did that make you a vegetarian?
It has some impact. And yeah, there's obviously, like seeing all that is quite gruesome. I think I had phases of that and try to eat less meat if I can, but I didn't become vegetarian. I think that is probably in the future for me. But yeah, I think it's a stark thing you have to sort of contemplate at that point.
Interesting.
So you went to university to do, you said pre-med or?
Yeah. So went down that pathway. Didn't get into medicine, so that's a long story short. But yeah, went through the first year and had a lot of exposure to what that sort of pathway might look like.
Okay. And then, but you switched to computer science in your master's degree.
Yeah. So after I did that, I kind of said, let's stick with biomedical science because it can still lead to some lab work that might be interesting, and there's potential to make an impact that way. But then, yeah, I guess after that degree, I was like, actually, the PhD projects available weren't as interesting to me. And so I thought, actually, I'm really making progress on the side. I was doing some programming on my laptop at home and doing, iPhone apps and this sort of thing. And that really gripped me. And then, yeah, so that was a transition. And I got a scholarship to go to Apple's developers conference in San Francisco. And that really kind of made me take the leap to, I can actually make a career out of this.
What kind of apps did you build?
Yeah, at that time, it was still combining the interests. So it was sort of personal health related apps that may be based on scientific papers, like what, how many steps should you take, or, how many hours sleep should you get? So it's kind of based on your age and your demographic more than just like this generic 10,000 steps. So that was sort of the personalized health era where lots of people were sort of quantifying themselves and tracking themselves and that sort of thing. So it's basically basic apps around that sort of thesis.
So is that still a personal interest of yours, kind of longevity? Do you use any trackers in your daily life?
I think the tracking has died out, but I'm definitely keen on that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm try and keep up with myself, even though I sit in the desk job, making sure I'm doing things outside of the desk so that I'm looking after myself a bit. So yeah, not so much the quantification. I think it's more about the motivation and keeping on top of your own health.
And then you did computer science, and then you started a first job somewhere, right? Maybe tell us a little bit more about kind of your first career steps.
Yeah, so I was originally trying to do startup type things in that space with those apps and those different health, sort of quantified health stuff. But obviously that was really challenging. I guess I was still a bit early. And so I decided, I need to get a job and pay the bills after the degree. And so that's when I got a job at an agency up in Auckland. And that was really a really great experience because I got to work on lots of different projects in a short period of time for large companies and, put out a project on various domains, so whether it's finance or insurance or whatever it might be. And that sort of meant that I could learn the whole process of creating a new project from scratch in a few months. And it was quite an intense pressure cooker kind of environment where you got to work quite hard to get those projects done. But it was quite rewarding to see really excellent developers, designers, and project managers in their prime basically working and observe that.
So when you say projects, you mean kind of products that you developed for different clients? Okay, interesting. And what was your favorite project in that time?
It has to be one of the internal ones they made. So they had this sort of reception kiosk app on the iPad. So there's some really cool Bluetooth beacon stuff. So you walk up to it if you had the app, and you'd sort of automatically show up on the screen, and you just press your face to sign in, kind of thing. So it's sort of like the Envoy app for small business at that point. I don't know if you've heard of that. Large companies have those sort of sign-in iPad kiosk things.
Interesting. Why did you like that one?
I think just some of those smart. So the company that I was working for had a lot of tech, I guess IP and sort of the Bluetooth beacon space. So using some of that to understand, where you are, and then tie that in with the cloud and some nice user experience was a really cool mix of factors in that project.
Did you during that time already think about kind of doing your own thing at some point?
Yeah. So in the nights and weekends, I was still thinking about what could I do, and then met my co-founder at the same time as well, and so we were sort of crunching nights and weekends on Litmaps at the time. So that was sort of like a longer term project.
Okay, so you got started while you were still kind of in a full-time job.
That was Kyle
that
you met?
Yep. Yeah. So we started at university in one of the student clubs, and then that was sort of as I transitioned out of university, we still kept in touch and kept meeting up and working on the early idea.
How did that idea come about?
Yeah, so as I was doing these sort of app projects, I guess I was talking about it with friends, and Kyle was one of them, and that I guess kind of led him to say, "Oh, I got this interesting project or idea about." He was doing his PhD, struggling with the literature review process, and wanted to create like a little graph of papers and how they connected. And I was like, "Yeah, sure, we can make that." And then that ended up being a multi-year startup project.
Why did that excite you? Like, why was that? What was it about that idea that made you interested?
Yeah, there was two parts of it. One is I just really, I guess a theme throughout my journey has been sort of applying my skills to a space that has an impact. So whether that was personal health or, maybe longevity stuff, or it's, helping scientists have a better toolkit so they can then help humanity with the outcomes that they're working on or the projects they're working on. That was a big pillar. And then the other one's just personal frustration. Like I'd tried to use the tools that he was showing me, and they were like, Windows 95, E6 kind of stuff that was really janky, and just made me like, man, this is really frustrating. They should have a tool like this, and it doesn't exist.
You weren't in academia yourself, right?
Yeah, I didn't progress beyond the sort of early bachelor's phase. Yeah, so I wasn't in that space.
Interesting. So like, how did you get conviction that this was like an interesting problem to work on, that was like a big enough need? Or did you just say, I'm going to help Kyle build this and it'll be fun?
Yeah, it's definitely the fun part of it, and getting into a space that was interesting. And, we had tried to read papers as undergraduates and things. That frustration was very high as well. So I guess the screw it, let's just have a go at it was very high for me. And then, over time, I was like, there's a large user base here. There's definitely a way to create a scalable solution and have impact beyond, just academia as well. But yeah, that was where I got the conviction, basically.
What was the, so you were mentioning this earlier, but what was the fundamental problem that your co-founder experienced in his PhD that he was so frustrated with that he came to you?
Yeah, so a lot of it's the, how do I know who's citing who, and what is the other papers out there that I should know about, basically. And so trying to avoid that repeat work or rework is one of the biggest things. So early on in the PhD, that's a lot of what you're spending your time doing, is identifying what your research gap is, or what areas you can contribute to, and what are the relevant papers for that.
How does that work without your solution currently? How do PhD candidates do that at the moment?
Yeah, a lot of this is still based on, keyword searching. So it's coming up with a really effective list of words that describes your problem space, and putting that into different tools like PubMed or Scopus or Web of Science or Google Scholar, finding the results from that. Are those papers relevant? And then if you're doing a systematic review, it's sort of downloading all of them and actually going through every one and kind of with your peers or with your group, figuring out which are relevant. And so that's kind of the status quo even today.
So maybe you can tell us a bit about just the industry as a whole, right? So most people are not familiar with what academia is like. So what's academia like, right? You have like grad students, postdocs, professors, like how does that whole kind of ecosystem work? And like, why are papers important? What is a paper? What are citations?
Yeah, that's great context to zoom out. So obviously there's, these institutions set up to help drive knowledge forward in some way. And so historically, it's kind of people working on a field of study, and they try and become an expert in something and represent the knowledge on that topic. So one of the ways that they do that is run, experiments, run research projects to say, I'm looking into a certain area, I got some hypotheses, I want to test them. And then the results of those experiments you'd write up into some sort of paper that you'd then share with your colleagues. And so that journal of papers, which would be a literal, like a magazine, I guess, print of these papers, would be the thing that you'd read and share. And then, you'd go to conferences and talk to your peers about that work, or maybe debate or try and come up with a better solution or better idea. And so I guess this is a very long tradition that started a long time ago. So there's a bunch of norms that have been built into this space. Obviously, some of that's evolving over time, but yeah, so there's sort of the principal researchers investigating areas, and then there's the teams that they're forming around them. So training the next generation of them, but also having people to execute some of those projects because they're quite large and they require lots of different fields of investigation. And I guess over time that's grown into a large industry. So there's not only within universities, there's companies that carry out research projects now. There's lots of facets to this, but I think that's probably a good overview of what this academic industry looks like.
And so what is a research paper?
Yeah, so I think basically it's your summary of what you've found based on this line of investigation and what are the next steps or outputs from that. So it does contain, how you framed your studies, what you did to execute them, and then sort of the questions and hypotheses that might have been proven true or false at the end.
Is research is it always that you've discovered something? Is it the right way to think about it? Like it's a way to sort of document a discovery that you make?
I think that's probably where it came from, but obviously as time goes on, a lot more of it's about publishing results. So you don't necessarily have a positive outcome, but you've just communicated what happened. But I think there's a lot of pressure to publish, so you have good metrics around your performance and sort of show that. So it's difficult to always publish negative things. You probably want to have positive results a lot of the time, and so there's a lot of pressures that come with publishing, which is where the publish or perish kind of mentality comes into it, because it does influence your job and your career.
So basically, the number of publications and which journal, so there's also different types of journals, right? And there's sort of better journals and worse journals. Who determines that?
Yeah, the tiers of quality I think are interesting. I think it's very community and peer based. I think, and historical based. So if it's whether it's nature or science, these sort of journals that have such high regard, a lot of that's just accrued based on the historical kind of record. But yeah, those tiers of journals you want to get as high as you can to sort of have that impact or recognition.
And then that is what people then use to determine how well you're doing in your career, sort of thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
And it also helps you with then getting a professorship somewhere, getting into really good research institutions.
Yeah, because often there'll be a panel that assesses basically those metrics from those papers, but also looks at each paper and sort of says, these are the top papers you published and maybe how impactful they've been.
So I've heard this thing about the replication crisis in academia. And can you talk a bit about that? With all these papers, a lot of these folks, they publish their methods and they publish their ideal. Presumably, if somebody could actually go and double check, right?
Yeah.
And the process of submitting a paper, there's reviewers of these journals who read your paper. They're not replicating your experiments. They're just reading what you wrote, right? So I can already see, and I think we've seen some of this stuff now. People get ChatGPT to draft a paper completely made up, and some journal accepts it. And it's and I've always kind of thought in my head, if you get these journals and they're sort of deciding what gets published or not, and what's sort of seen as groundbreaking research, but the reviewers are generally not paid and generally just reading the thing. And I don't know, how can they know if this thing is true or not, if it's correct or not? Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I think there's a few parts to that. So one is just why is there a replication crisis, I guess, is number one. I think part of that is just the volume of publication. So over time, there's more and more countries producing more and more research papers, which, is just the volume thing. It's just hard to replicate a lot of this because there's a lot of work being done. It takes you a lot of work as well to go through what someone else has done and actually replicate it. And the other part to that is sort of the trade secret element, I guess, if you will, of knowing them, they might say a method, but there might be really key steps missing, or there's sort of some hidden stuff baked in there. Or maybe example is, a paper gets published on an AI model, but a lot of the secret source of how that actually gets done is not written down. So that's an element where it's really hard to reproduce, partly because of, they want to also protect their unique, I guess, IP in some way, even though it's not actually a patent or anything like this. So that's a big part of, I think, also what goes on. And the other part of it is, maybe it's controversial, but there's sort of a a gatekeeper effect, I think, a little bit with reviewers in terms of if you're the expert in that space, you sort of have a set of, these are the key papers in my head of what you should kind of be citing. And so if a paper doesn't cite those things, you're kind of like, well, that's a signal that they haven't really understood the topic or done research. And so really groundbreaking stuff is hard to come by. So it's a signal that it's hard to overcome that sort of that established scientific record, which is valid in some ways because it's a high bar to create a breakthrough. But it also means that there's a lot of, biases in some way of what you should be citing, whether that's correct or not, is a part of the review process, I guess, because it's how do you have some sort of quality bar, whether that should exist or not. Part of, the preprint process is to get around that a little bit, to just put your paper up on archive and then people can kind of see it before it gets reviewed. So there are, evolutions to this process, but there's definitely that sort of, I don't know the right term, but reviewer number 2 effect, where there's someone just comes in and says you should be citing this and kind of tanks your paper.
Right. I mean, I guess on the like replication crisis piece, and just you're saying more volume. I've heard also, and Peter Thiel talks about this, that like generally scientific progress feels like it's slowed, whereas more money has been pumped into science and more publications come out of research institutions every year. How would you, I guess, do you agree with that? And like, how do you sort of think about that? Like, why is that the case?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of my take on that is sort of the atoms versus bits arena. So, there's parts of science where, if it's applications could be dangerous or something, where it's, maybe it's research into certain technologies that are under ITAR or something. It's like, how does these sort of, impacts of advancing those bits technologies, if it leads to, some effects that you can't control, I guess, from a nation state point of view. So there is I can understand some of that argument. And obviously in the element of bits, we've made a lot of progress in some spaces. So I guess is there just a hard problem that we're running up into as things get, in the nanoscale, things get even smaller and we get into things like quantum computing, which, might be a different rate of progress than when we're working on circuits that are, very large. So I don't know if there's actually just a limit of hardness that we're running up against, or there's some sort of, some things going on behind the scenes that are saying, actually, we don't want progress in these areas. But those are the difficult conversations. I don't know the right answer there, but definitely we are running up to harder problems, and the low-hanging fruit, I think, has been picked in a lot of spaces.
So I think probably, with the tools we have, right? Like, because the tools take you so far. So like, there's probably like the 80-20 rule, where like you get 80% of the return for like 20, but then like the remaining 80% gets you like incremental. So I get that. Yep. I mean, the rules piece that you cite, kind of what kinds of areas are off limits? What does that even mean? Kind of, where's that?
Yeah, I don't know if I even believe that fully, but it's just a theory of, maybe you want to advance nuclear research in some way, and then actually that's, not allowed because of some other reason, but I'm not sure whether it's a national security thing or whether it's, just something that is a sensitive topic. I don't know, maybe it's propulsion using nuclear technology or something.
Is there any like good alternative to the peer review process? Because as I pointed out all the problems, right? But so far this is still how we do things.
Yeah, I don't know if the process itself is broken. I think it also could be just the funding model for science. So if there was, 10x more funding, then maybe the peer review process is not as important because the hiring decisions are easier because you can hire more people. So the emphasis comes off on the, hey, you've got to publish, a lot of stuff. You can actually just do some work and have results maybe. And I don't know how you measure those results. So that's a tricky thing with.
So what you're saying is if you had more money, you could actually not be as selective about who you fund.
Yeah, there's sort of less emphasis on maybe some of those processes, I think, which is driving the temperature up on everybody being forced into, I got to get into this high impact.
But like, wouldn't we still want to know if those folks, if there's some kind of ROI on that money spent?
Sure, but I think it's the gap between, sort of basic research and sort of applied and more industry focused research. So yeah, the theory is you just turn up the basic research and yes, there's lots of things you can't measure, but you're going to have lots of people making interesting insights into things, and then that will lead to ROI down the track. I don't know how you can measure this, whether the research that went into, microwaves or whatever back in the day, and then now you get an industry that creates a microwave or other nuclear magnetic resonance technologies, whatever it is. But the basic physics research that went into it, maybe they got funded in the Manhattan Project or something. But yeah, it's like, how do you sort of, the ROI is disconnected, I think. And I don't know if the way to.
Yeah, because that's. I mean, I was in research for a number of years, and some things were pretty relevant. We're working on cancer, but other things, we work on, some very particular genetic mutation in a nematode, and like how specific like protein maybe translates that, you know, that RNA into another protein, like, and there's like some like very, very obscure, I'd say esoteric ideas, which are like intellectually kind of interesting, curious in of themselves. But I do kind of wonder, and like, sure, you can argue that like by finding that out, maybe someone else can use that knowledge to answer another question that leads to something. But is that kind of the best argument for why fund like really esoteric research? That like it just basically broadens out the horizon of knowledge, which then helps everyone kind of eventually, or what's, is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I guess that's one way, is this you are maybe pushing forward something you don't understand that has an impact later. That's probably one way to put it. Because it's unclear if you can really ahead of time know, like, oh, this area is going to be really valuable. Because I guess it would have already be priced in, right? Like you'd already have access to that knowledge, or maybe have made some steps towards seeing the value realized. So yeah, I think that's my take right now, is that you kind of just have to let 1,000 flowers grow, and then you can harvest it later, but without doing that.
Yeah, I guess that's also the question of who's funding what, right? I guess if it's, if there's an application and something that creates an ROI at some point in 10, 20 years, it's probably more industry who should fund it versus, very, very basic esoteric research where the ROI isn't clear, but it just adds to the knowledge of humans, right? That should probably be a decision by governments, elected governments, if we're funding this or not, right?
Yeah, because it's hard to know like who's making the decisions and where does the funding sit. So I guess it's fallen to the government because they're sort of that outside of the private sector kind of role. Maybe there's another way of doing this, but at least, yeah, that's one way of going about it.
Henrik, your wife does some research, right?
Yeah.
What
She's in that.
is it like? Is it, would you say it's fairly, what is it again? Something about refugees, I think, right? Like, how do you think about that, given that you're so close to it?
Yeah, no, she's an economist, so she publishes a lot on. Well, she's doing migration economics, so looking at how different sort of migration flows in the past have influenced labor market outcomes or voting behavior, even just kind of like, yeah, what were the effects? It's a very slow process, I will say. Like she's been working on some papers for 5, 6, 7 years. I think my main observation is that I think the peer review process is just fundamentally broken. I think without saying too much, like she has peer reviewers who kind of, give her comments on her papers that are probably not, relevant, and they haven't really understood what she's doing, and they haven't really looked at, haven't tried to replicate what she's doing, as you were saying, Mark, right? So, and that takes a long time, right? She sends her paper somewhere 6 months, 12 months until it comes back with very irrelevant comments, and then she has to do it again with the next journal. So it's just a very, very inefficient process. That's why I was asking if there's any alternative that you see.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe there's an element of sort of open peer review that is starting to happen, where maybe I don't know, if there's some blinding of who they are, but at least maybe if they're doing arbitrary comments or something, there's some sort of open process, so you can maybe push back or have some sort of dialogue with them. But yeah, I think it's not perfect. I was just hinting at sort of maybe there's other incentives causing that happen.
Yeah. And out of curiosity, I mean, one thing she sees a lot in her field, I'm curious what you see, is that the Trump administration is obviously like cutting back a lot of funding for universities, for research, and that already has an effect on the job market for economists. Do you see that in some of the customers and the clients you work with?
Yeah, we aren't seeing the direct effects yet. I think it's going to take some time for that to happen. But yeah, definitely seeing those funding cuts or grant cuts, then that would flow down into, principal investigator not having some money for their lab group to have Litmaps, for example, as a subscription.
Right. Maybe that's a good point to transition to what you're actually doing at Litmaps.
Yeah, so maybe we can go back to kind of when your co-founder came to you with this problem that he had. What were the first steps that you were taking? And then, tell us about the vision that you had initially and maybe how it changed over time.
Yeah, so essentially the first idea was to, he was studying something in bio-nanotechnology. So there was an idea of, is there sort of a bottom-up self-assembly nature to the citation network or the papers that are out there? And saying, using that principle, we can organize scientific literature into a useful map of the landscape, basically. And so using that process, we created this one map for all of science. And so you could maybe see, hey, I have this paper, what's sort of around me as being relevant. So that was an interesting project. We did the tech behind it and had a product that kind of worked, but it wasn't that useful. So that was the first step, that was the idea. We got a sort of a prototype together. And
when you say a map, what do you mean?
So it's a 2D plane where papers are placed based on their data publication, and then vertically they have sort of this edge minimization of like coming close to neighbors that cite each other.
And the idea was to what did you want to kind of like see with that? What did that show you?
Yeah, the sort of naive approach was, you have biology here, and then you'd have sort of biochemistry next to it, and then chemistry, and you maybe see some sort of overlap of papers in relevant fields, kind of seeing the intersections between this domain and another domain that you're not familiar with, but has some useful aspects for your own work.
And what did you see?
We basically saw this massive blot of dots that was kind of random ordered, and that organizing principle didn't work.
Why not? Well, why do you think that was?
I think one is just the time dimension is really hard, because if you are related, but you're far away in time, then you kind of don't have the opportunity to come close. But also, yeah, the citation network itself is kind of fuzzy, and lots of things don't have citations. So you end up with this mass of papers that don't get organized and some that kind of get pulled together. So yeah, there's a mix of factors going on.
And so you've built the first kind of prototype or the first version of this. And then what were the next steps? Did you take it to other PhD candidates or to universities directly? What were the first kind of few years?
So I did skip a couple of steps. So that was like the idea, and we got there. But to get there, we actually added another co-founder, Diggle. And so he actually helped make that come to life. And so that was the sort of front end piece. And then I was doing more of the APIs in the back end. Yeah, adding that team member was a massive milestone for us. So we got into a small accelerator in Te Papa in Wellington, and that helped get us to that first prototype. So that was a massive step forward.
How did you get feedback from people who should use that further down the line?
Yeah, so that first step, we sent that prototype to friends at the University of Auckland Faculty of Medical and Health Science and said, "What do you think of this tool?" And we got various feedback. One, "Oh, this is really interesting," or "This is useless. What are you doing?" And so yeah, that was sort of the first round of feedback, was really just getting in the hands of users and getting that direct feedback.
Right. Was there a lot of people who didn't understand what this was for and pushback, or was it overwhelmingly positive? You should do this. We'll buy it from you.
Yeah, most of that first prototype was basically negative feedback, or some positives, but mainly negative. And so that was like us saying, "Oh, actually, there's something wrong here. We need to go back to the drawing board."
Right. And on this, I mean, you've been on this for quite a few years now, right? Was there ever kind of a point in the entire process where you were like, maybe we're not on the right path here, and maybe there isn't something here?
Yeah, definitely questioned things many times, but also had this sort of conviction that there's something there and we just got to find it. So yeah, definitely we tore up a lot of prototypes, and over time, did more and more testing with people and slowly honed in on what we got today. But yeah, also, thought a lot about, maybe this should change radically.
Right. And was the accelerator the moment where you said, okay, I'm going to do this full time, I'm going to go all in on this?
It was actually after we got incubated at Creative HQ. And so that was a really great step. And we got some R&D funding that helped get me there. Kyle went full time, and that was really, he took a big leap for us. But yeah, that step got me in full time.
It's quite a scary thing though, right? Like if you go from like a, fully like full-time job where you get a paycheck every month to, I think there's something here. And I'm going to, leave my job and I'm going to focus on this full time. How did you feel about this in the beginning? Did you always have that conviction that it's going to work out, or take us a little bit through your thinking there?
Yeah, that was a really hard one. I think I should have probably quit earlier and gone on to it. I think just that opportunity of getting that R&D grant really helped make that possible. But yeah, it's also just knowing that we've got some traction with users as well. So we had, we posted Litmaps on Product Hunt, for example, and people were really, really liking it there. And so there's some of the user feedback also made me think, actually, we can jump on and make progress.
And how did the product evolve? So you're saying the first version kind of was not very useful. What did you guys kind of learn, and how did you move the product?
Yeah, so really specifically, it was like you've got this massive map of everything, but what we learned was you really only care about your little domain of that, so your suburb, if you will, in the movie analogy. And so we had some algorithms that helped identify like main paths of the network and what's relevant to your papers if you upload them and what's around. So that's really where we went, is just focus on the few papers that matter, and then the visualization becomes a lot easier and clear.
Can you share a screen? We'd love to like kind of understand.
Yeah, sure.
You can walk us through what that looks like.
Mark, did you ever publish a paper in your PhD?
I was only there for maybe like 6 months or 8 months out of the year.
And you're busy doing other things, right?
Yeah, Henrik, I guess you know how I spend my time now. So the PhD was like one of like 5 things.
All right. Essentially, you've got maybe a research topic to start off with, and that's where the starting point for Litmaps is. But also you might have one or two papers you already know, and you can import those from, your reference manager or a BibTeX file if you use LaTeX, something like this. And so maybe I can start off with some papers I've already imported into our tool. And basically we just have this big blue button that says find other papers like this. And so we use various techniques to do this. You'll see the results from here. And so I basically uploaded, I don't know how many papers there are here. There's about 15 or so. And so from those papers, like what are the other ones that have other similar citation patterns or are they similar to this? And so I can have a look around. I can click on go and view the full text if I have access. And this is sort of like a quick, hey, show me what else is out there. And then you can use different search types. So we can look at co-authorships or what is the sort of paper talking about through a large language model kind of semantic search as well.
And so Axton, just to be clear, you put in a paper, you gave it one paper and it gave you all the papers that it has cited?
So I just started with a little reference set, but yeah, you could upload one paper. We look at the references of that, and then we say, what are the citations and the co-citations that are relevant? So it's kind of like almost a 2-degree network search around what you start from in terms of network science.
Right. So if I have my kind of working draft of my new paper, I can upload it and see, okay, who do I need to know? Like, what papers do I need to read? Who should I be aware of?
Yeah, exactly. So you can upload that reference list that's at the end of your paper, and that's where we would kick off our recommendations from.
And what exactly would I be trying to find when I'm using Litmaps? Like what exactly is my intended sort of goal? What am I trying to do?
Yeah, so a lot of the time it's, have you missed a key citation? So maybe there's a method in your field that there's a sort of key type of technique that you need to reference, or maybe it's what has been done in the past that's similar to what I'm working on. And then when you go to submit or get other people to review your work, they're not going to say, hey, there's this other key paper that you didn't know about that's out there. So it's kind of what is the prior art in my field in some ways, and what is the sort of latest science on this topic as well, by going forward in time and looking at who's citing the paper.
So what you're looking here on the right is what's inside the circle and what's outside the circle?
Yeah, so this is an example of, we have different Litmaps, if you will, or ways of looking at the scientific literature. So this is a visualization of my stuff is on the inside, and this blue ring is sort of recommendations to us. And so you can see lines between these papers citing my stuff and my stuff citing this other stuff. So it's a way of separating what I know and what's out there. And we have different diagrams for each search type. So if I bring up the sort of common authors approach, it'll look at authors on the papers that I provided, pull out other papers that have similar authorship patterns of these people working together.
And I remember you said, there's in economics, for example, you don't really publish a lot of papers. As I said, sometimes it takes you years, right? And there's other fields who publish very regularly. Is there specific, I guess, verticals or research fields that your tool is being used more than in others?
Yeah, definitely. So the topics or the fields that publish on arXiv, for example, so that's computer science, it's physics, it's maths and other topics. They're really highly published, as well as bioarchive, so biomedical sciences and that sort of thing. They're quite high usage verticals. Things like maybe literature, like English and stuff, have a history of citations, but also frequency of publication. So different fields publish at different rates, and those areas are definitely more popular.
Axton, the one we're looking at, I'm seeing all the names are Chinese. Do you know why? Is that because this area of research is funded in China? Just do you have any kind of data around country of origin
so obviously
research?
China is now one of the biggest countries that output publications by volume. And it's just based on, what is the last name of the first author? And a lot of scientists know, if you know this person, then you'll just look for their last name and they published a paper in 2012. It's about this topic. That's sort of the mental model that a lot of people have in their heads.
Oh, and presumably, if you're Chinese, you're publishing, citing your friends or people who you know who are also Chinese. I see. So that's why. So it's not.
So these people have published a lot together in my map or in the papers I've provided.
I see.
And then these are the other papers they've worked on together.
So it's not necessarily that this area of research is dominated by China. It's more that these folks publish together.
Yep.
I see. And cite
each
other.
It'll vary depending on topic and the papers that I'm putting into our tool.
And why? So is this only sort of used for kind of like a double check to make sure you don't miss any big article in your field, or is there some other use cases that folks have?
Yeah, that's definitely a big one. Another one is just, I have one paper that I've been given and I want to know what else is out there. And so instead of doing a keyword search, this is sort of a quick bootstrap into that. So if I do an example here, I've just selected one paper, show me what else is out there. And this is a really common use case.
And what is it you're doing now? You select one paper and you want to do what?
So I want to see, based on that paper, its citations and its references, what else is in this area. And so a lot of people just upload the one paper they know from their supervisor or that they've come across, and then go through each of these and kind of read them and sort of understand whether they're relevant or not. So it's literally just clicking on each of these papers and going through the work of reading the full text and understanding what these mean.
I see. And so if I understand correctly, basically you're looking at an area, presumably the area like I guess research is more like it's sort of incremental in some ways, right? Like it sort of builds on the previous stuff. So
yeah, exactly.
By seeing who's connected, who's citing who, you can presumably, so you're not actually doing any kind of like search. You don't know like what area you're even looking at, right? The only thing you're doing is just linking citation.
Yeah, so this mode is just that. And obviously we do more than that, but that's the core, is really that papers citing each other, looking back and forth on that sort of tree of science, if you will, or academia. And maybe you go back and say, oh, I know this paper, but it's based on this 1999 paper, and I need to look into that one because that's kind of the fundamental thing that this paper is based from. And then you can go back even further beyond that.
What's the meaning of the proximity between the dots? So if it's closer, what does that mean?
Yeah, so this one is, it's a timeline on the x-axis. So it's earlier, later, or more recent, and vertically citation count. So this one has the most citations of this. So you can imagine a sort of a diagonal line of, this is sort of the norm as you accrue more citations over time. But if you're sort of on the top right triangle, you're maybe, better than the standard citation rate, if you will.
Got it.
Excellent. What's the most cited paper in the world?
It's got to be, I think maybe the attention is all you need paper. So one of the papers behind the modern transformer attention mechanism in LLMs, I think it has hundreds of thousands of citations or something like this.
It's a pretty recent paper. I would have imagined it would be like an older paper.
Yeah, I've seen some other ones, and they're just mistakes in the metadata. It's like, some sort of error. But yeah, I think that's a massive paper that's been cited.
And do you see any kind of other interesting trends in publication data? Like, I don't know, what sort of areas are growing faster than others? Which areas are shrinking? Which countries are dominating?
Yeah, we see some of that. Obviously, we focus a lot on just individual use cases for people. So some of that broader understanding of the metadata is not what we spend a lot of our time on. But yeah, we do see, computer science growing massively, and countries like China coming up. But there's also countries like Indonesia and others that in our user base are really highly reflected. So I guess that reflects some of their ambitions to grow and industrialize and move up the value chain.
And your user base is mostly PhD candidates or all the way to kind of professors?
Yeah, that's right. So the bulk of them are graduate students. So they're from master's to PhD and some postdocs. And then we have some small amount of professors and undergraduates. And then, an even smaller proportion of commercial industry researchers.
Can you talk a little bit about the scale of where you are today? So you founded Litmaps about 9 years ago, is that right? That's when you really started?
Yeah, that's when we incorporated, yeah.
And where are you today in terms of kind of, size, customers, revenue numbers?
Yeah, so we have basically grown to 400,000 users total of the user base and roughly about UK monthly active, which has been really cool to get to that level. And then from that user base, we're now just past 1 mil of annual recurring revenue run rate for New Zealand dollars. So it's really exciting to get past that sort of, I guess, milestone where
milestone,
yeah.
And you acquired a company as well, right?
Yeah, so we just did a capital raise, and we've used some of that funds to acquire an asset, another product, and we're merging that with our tool. So we're really excited about the possibilities there.
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
Yeah, congratulations on the capital raise. I think that's big news for your company.
And you started off, I guess, on the technical side. You were CTO initially.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then somewhere in the whole story, your co-founder Kyle, got excited about a few other things and moved to the US, right, to do some work there. Yeah, that must have been a pretty rough time. Like, how'd you guys think about that? You obviously stepped up and you've been doing great, but at the time, I'm sure it wasn't so obvious that things were gonna be as good, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a big transition, and so I think we spent a lot of years together working on it, and yeah, it's a big change for a co-founder to leave. So I think that had an impact. But I think also he felt that we were really set up for success with, you know, capital and having a team together and some traction early on. So I think, yeah, we really felt that we could, you know, have a really good go at the strategy and the plan on our own. So that definitely was a massive change and impacted us. But also we felt, me and Diggle, that we could carry on as the remaining co-founders.
And like, did you have to like kind of grow into that role? What have you learned kind of going from
Yeah,
CTO
definitely.
to CEO?
Yeah, definitely. And a big part of that has been, you know, some of our investors recommend coaching, and that's been a massive thing for me, just having someone who's sort of on your side and not in a stakeholder kind of position or an employee or something like this. So you got a sort of independent relationship, and it's really great to have a coach. So that's been massive for me to sort of, you know, transform me a little bit into that CEO role. And obviously I keep a lot of the other attributes and are very technical and can go into the weeds, but also, you know, getting out there in front of people, pitching and doing a lot of the CEO stuff that requires you to be out there in front of the world.
And was that Daniel Batten who's been coaching you?
Yeah, so he was one of the investors and had coached me a lot, and I know he's been on your podcast before, so shout out to Daniel. Also, he had other coaches in his group that he's worked with, and so yeah, there was a few other coaches in his group that I worked with.
Very cool. So what do you think are the big, you know, things that you had to learn or overcome personally to become a better CEO? Like going from just kind of building a product to building like the company, building the team.
Yeah, it's definitely those things that you would expect. So it's the people interactions, it's the, you know, the pitching and able to, you know, sell the message as well as not just the message itself. So it's the medium of that, if you will. So it's also getting yourself right in a lot of ways. So whether that's just dealing with pressures and things that come up is really important. And also these groups that we do coaching with, it's sort of more a mastermind group where there's other founders as well as a coach. So that's a really nice venue to see what other people are dealing with. And there's sort of, you know, more science-based founders who struggle with maybe some of the similar things and have similar attributes that you can really learn from and grow. So yeah, that's been a really great group as well, because you sort of see each other and keep each other in check in some ways to learn those really successful habits.
So what's next for you? At 1 million revenue, you just raised around. What do the next 18 months, the next 3 years look like?
Yeah, so the massive focus, obviously, this integration of our merge of our acquired product. So making sure that it goes off really successfully is a massive focus to get us to the 5 mil ARR mark. So that's really the thrust of the next 2 years or so. So that's a massive focus for us.
Right. And what's the kind of bigger vision if you look at the next, I don't know, 10 years or 20 years? Where do you think this could go?
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity for us. Obviously, we've got a really good inroads and an opportunity with the graduate student and academic market. But we also know there's a really big opportunity in the commercial R&D space. So getting the sort of value out of papers, so whether that's, you know, analyzing full text and helping people just get to the heart of the paper they want to know about. Also understanding what the competitors are doing. So if you're a company, so that IP landscape and freedom to operate, looking around, and also knowing what the risks are if there's other companies that have portfolios that might impact you in the future. So there's things like this that are really, really valuable for us that we have ambitious goals to execute on.
Right. So you would sell directly into like R&D departments of like big pharma, big tech, these kinds of companies?
Yeah, I'm already doing some of this. So that, you know, we've got some users in those spaces and they're kind of pulling us and want us to add things and educate us. So, there's even investors looking at or using our product and paying for it to help them identify, you know, a deep tech opportunity or a new drug to invest in terms of pharmaceutical clinical trial work as well. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities there.
Why wouldn't they just do a typical like Google search or ChatGPT search or Google paper search? Like what would you offer somebody like R&D lab or an investor that they can do with existing tools?
Yeah, so the angle is really we can add something that they don't have. So it's sort of saying we've got these search techniques that are going to add value and find things that you aren't seeing for those other channels. And your competitors might be doing it. So you want to also do that. And then it's also the process element. So if you are running those teams and having those sort of projects, we're going to be the tool where everyone lives and you can sort of store your work. And then based on that, you're sort of getting these recommendations that are really honed in on what you care about. And so I guess there's an element of, you store your stuff with us, you get a better result as well as instead of just using those ad hoc tools.
And because I think a lot of people, when you started, ChatGPT didn't exist, right? AI didn't really exist. Now, you have deep research, which can go in and like spend like up to like 30 minutes researching, reading papers. Sometimes when I want to deep dive into a topic, I set deep research off overnight, right? And I come back in the morning and it's like, it's been going for 30, 40 minutes. And it gives me like very well cited, like very in-depth understanding. Like, How do you guys think about that and that behavior that people have now? How does that impact what you guys are building? Have you thought about, is that like a threat? Is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, it's obviously there's both in there. So there's the threat of replacing some of what we do, but also the opportunity of, some of that process shortcuts the education process, I guess, of new people coming up and trying to have a thoughtful insight or struggle with the topic and then build their own intelligence in some ways. So it does replace some of that, which lends ourselves to helping educate new people coming through. But then, yeah, there's a lot of technology behind this that we can sort of leverage and also show that if we are the preferred sort of interface for people doing these explorations, so diving through reference lists, you might even imagine AIs themselves using this sort of tool to navigate or jump through. But yeah, we're definitely trying to support the human to have that sort of assistive tool that makes a difference. And yeah, I think deep research and all that is definitely proving the way of maybe it replaces some people or lets people do a lot more. And so I guess we're trying to provide a suite of tools that combine some of the best of that with some of the older approaches.
Have you seen the whole, I mean, to your point of like maybe AI uses this, like Anthropic released, I don't know if you've seen this MCP servers in Google, more recently released agent-to-agent framework. Have you guys created MCP server and allowed AI to kind of come in and leverage what you have? Or
we've done plugins with ChatGPT and things like this, so that's in the initial foray. I think, some of the MCP stuff looks really cool, and I'm keen to work on that. Obviously, we have limited time, so there's always a bandwidth question. But yeah, there's definitely an element of if we have a fast citation network that tools can use, then yeah, it would be really useful for them to plug into that.
And what is, I mean, this is one thing that I've always kind of tried to understand. Like, what is it that like you kind of long term offer that like they can get from like an like a Google whatever papers or a ChatGPT? Like, can't it give you the same information? Like, hey, I'm looking at this topic, give me all the top relevant papers. Can I get the same information in those other places? Like, how does Litmaps sort of like offer something unique to the user?
Yeah, so there's definitely the shortcutting of diving through the reference list. So obviously it might say, hey, these are the top 10 papers on the subject, and you go into it. But then when you're reading those and you want to know, oh, what are those papers based on? You don't have to sort of prompt us again. You can sort of just click and dive through the tool in this graph interface. So I guess it's sort of consolidating some of the knowledge graph that sort of is in your head around these papers cite each other, or ChatGPT can give you that, but it's sort of in a diagram or a framework that's kind of makes intuitive sense to someone who is visual, I guess, with our eyes, but also just saving work in terms of going back through what's been done before and based on history. So yeah, there's that
That's
sort of
interesting
approach.
So kind of like a workflow tool for research.
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of what we've been doing as well, is not only these different search algorithms and stuff, but it's also what is the workflow that makes the most sense for whatever you're trying to do.
Right. And is there currently tools, like, I don't remember of any tools that I used when I was doing my PhD. I mean, this was quite a while ago. So are there existing tools that people use to do research, or how do people currently, because I guess that's a very interesting idea, right? Like, you can use us as like the repository, all your citations are here, all your research here, maybe you can take notes here, you can actually even write the papers inside of Litmaps. Is there existing products, or are you kind of like, is that where you're going?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of tools that, reference managers have existed for a long time. So that's where you obviously save and store papers. And then there's sort of the separate class of tools where you do searching and that sort of thing, and writing up. So I think over time, we're sort of trying to combine the best parts of search processes and reference management and just in one tool. And, there's a lot to do there, but that's sort of where we're heading. And yeah, I think there's lots of other competing offerings that take different spins on this, whether it's a writing tool combined with a reference manager. So yeah, I guess we're trying to help with that discovery process and keeping ourselves organized along the way.
That's cool. If you were to run the NIH or run the US government or some big funding organization, right, and you were in charge of funding research, and you like basically have a lot of money, and you kind of want, like, I don't know, important things to come out on the back end. How would you structure that? Given what you've seen with what with the current kind of process of publishing, citations, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm inspired by the sort of DARPA model where you sort of have really empowered, I can't remember what they call them, sort of project leads or something, you have this thing you're trying to investigate and figure out that needs to be invented, and they run and they have a lot of agency and freedom and funding behind them. So you'd have to place a lot of trust in these people, but I guess that's sort of the model that I think has shown results in terms of DARPA printing out results, and there's other efforts that have been modeled after this, like ARPA-H and things like this as well. And I think the UK is also doing an equivalent of this. So I think that's kind of the model. I don't know how, each domain might be different in terms of the types of people that go into them and some of the norms, but definitely in terms of results and speed and trying to get bang for buck, I guess, in some way, that seems like a model, if you had a bunch of money, that I would say is something that works, because it's really based on small teams that are empowered and have the agency to make things happen.
What about the publication process itself and the review process and the journals and those things? Like, do you think those are net positive or net negative? Is there ways to like change or reform that? I mean, I know now people have gone and there's been a lot of, there's these like sort of, what do you call them, open source journals or journals that don't, because a lot of these journals also, the top tier ones, they charge a fee, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a racket. It's like taxpayer funded research. And then you have to like, you as a person who's like funded this research can't actually read the research, right?
Yeah, the pay to publish model has replaced the pay to read.
So I know there's some like innovation, a little bit of innovation there. Like, what's your kind of sense on kind of that whole
I think what we would like is, just an historical record, basically, of like people have tried these types of experiments, these are results, or these are ideas that people are producing, and then you can sort of see where they've come from. So maybe a litmap showing that sort of tree of what's been done and what it's based on. So it's less about I've created this perfect paper and this work. It's more of a messy kind of, I've got these inputs to the system and these are the results that came out of it. And you don't have the discrete sort of papers that are published. I think that's a lot more of what people are trying to get out of it. So it'd be much more of a practical history tool that, is a record of what's been attempted, and then you can go off and try your different approach. So maybe that takes AI to reformat the literature into something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe that's where we go eventually. But I think that's kind of what it would look like. And then maybe there would be some sort of review model where you'd get your peers could input. Maybe it's like a public pull request kind of thing where, you're sort of showing what you've done and then people giving you feedback or saying, have you thought about this? I think that's kind of the approach. But obviously there's a private public model where, there's some sensitivity. So you probably don't want everything to be public all the time. So there's some, I don't know where you make those trade-offs, but there's definitely an element of, we just want this historical record that's useful. And that's would be my starting point.
How do you think about like, this idea of now there's this geopolitical competition between the US and China, and feels like we're sort of entering a whole new age where there's like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and then like, the rest of the Western world. And, this whole idea of collaborating and publishing and having an open ecosystem where you share knowledge, like that only, it feels like that only works within like a rule-based order where everyone kind of plays by the same rules and people don't start wars and people don't try to take over other territories and violate countries' rights. In that kind of like world, what do you think happens to the scientific process?
Yeah, I think we're definitely going to be impacted by not everybody being able to share ideas and work with everybody else in every other country. So it's definitely going to be these sort of federated networks where you're in some sort of allied partner countries, and then you can work together and have those, or expend a lot of effort to get around those sort of partnerships and groups. So I think that's partly, those massive collaborations where you get lots of countries working together, like a CERN type thing. Maybe there's less of that. So definitely you see less of this. I don't know as well, though, the pressures of geopolitical competition might also amp up, innovations in some way, like drones, things where there's just a need, you have to have this new capability, and that will also push things forward. So not always a positive example, but that's an example of the pressure of needing these outputs will also cause advancements.
Do you think things will slow down because of this, or speed up because you'll just want to out-innovate your competitors?
Well, that's the thing. I think there'll be different effects for different spaces. Some spaces will accelerate because of necessity. Other spaces will slow down because there's less shared collaborative effort, where maybe there's less funding, but if you pool your resources, you could make advances. So I think there's going to be a mix, and it's unclear which arenas are going to advance and which arenas are going to slow down.
Do you think Australia and New Zealand are over or under investing in research overall, especially like really fundamental research?
I think, I mean, it seems that there's underinvestment, but I don't know what level of, this is the GDP level and this is what you should be investing. I don't really know what that looks like. I think it's always less than you would like. But also I think there's, what is the ability for a country to lend and get finance and fund these things? And also what are the demographic structures of the country to fund, if you've got aging population, then you've got to spend a lot on, treatments and other things for that. So I think there's a massive calculus of like, what are the things you have to spend on and what's, I guess, unfortunately, what is left for science and things like this. But yeah, I think in that model, I think we've been in an era where there's lots of people earning a lot in the sort of demographic ages where they're most productive, and there's more taxes and more revenue for things to be funded. And we're entering an era where, as a demographic shift, then there's going to be less available. So yeah, it seems as everyone's going to have less, and we'll have to make do with that.
I mean, yeah, like it sort of feels like, does a smaller kind of region like Australia, New Zealand, do they need to invest in fundamental research, or is that best left to like the bigger players, right, that have like economies of scale, like US and China, maybe Europe to some extent? Is that something you have an opinion on?
Yeah, I think my opinion is if there is advantages that we have, then, it makes a lot of sense for us to do that. But also, I think as the era changes and we get more into this sort of friend networks and countries that have to pair, then, we sort of have to be somewhat self-sufficient in some areas. And that means we probably have to fund things that where there's another country that's an expert, but we just need some capability there. So I think, yeah, there's a mix of exploiting our advantages, but also we're going to have some sort of base across lots of different areas that maybe we could have relied on other countries for in the past.
Yeah, I think as the US is cutting back on research funding, I think it's a massive opportunity to attract a lot of people to this region and fund things that the US would have funded otherwise. Yeah, and, harness the ROI in maybe 10 or 20 years once that research gets commercialized.
Yeah, and getting people to live here and love the culture and be here is kind of why things like, I think, the Robinson Institute, Victoria University started. I think that person moved here and then started this whole sort of superconducting sort of specialty that has now borne a lot of fruit. So there's definitely examples of that we want to continue.
Cool. Maybe to wrap up, I guess you grew up in New Zealand, you started your company in New Zealand, but you're very much a global company, right? I guess you're selling to customers all over the globe.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel the need to kind of go to the US, spend some time in Europe, or how do you think about building a global company from New Zealand?
Yeah, definitely. I feel that pull. So, I've done lots of trips to the US and Europe to make sure I'm in touch with that. And a lot of that is to do with the important people in the space and being able to network with them and have a conversation that's not, via a Zoom, and you have that sort of, there's definitely that sort of gossip element of knowing who's around and what matters. So getting out and market is really important. But I think also it's having that, you're kind of a bit out on the edge and you can do something a bit different, a bit radical when you're here as well. So I think it's that need to travel and be exposed, but also come back and build something and then go back and share it. So I think there's an interesting mix, and it takes more effort for us to do that. But I think I'm certainly in the camp where you need to make the effort to go out and do those things. And I think after COVID, I think it changed a lot, but also emphasized the need to build those relationships and be in person sometimes.
Right. Cool. No, great. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And congratulations again on the fundraise. Super exciting milestone. We will follow your journey from here.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Thanks for spending time.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to TechMates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with friends. We'll be back soon with more stories of Kiwi and Aussie founders reshaping the future and disrupting down under. Until next time, keep dreaming big and daring to disrupt.